there's no doubt that centrally this government has got its target on national collective bargaining. It clearly wants to move things to a local level. Employers are similarly moving that particular direction because they see, or they think they can get a better deal in that situation. Now, United's position is quite clearly to try and maintain and indeed improve national collective bargaining if we can. That's not to say that we'll do it at all costs, because quite clearly there are situations where in fact it can be that national collective bargaining won't deliver, and in those circumstances we have to look for some alternatives. But the experience, an analogy of experience, is almost in terms of outsourcing. If you take local government as a classic case, we've had for many years refuse collection and indeed catering and other services outsourced. You can actually contrast what's happened with refuse collection compared to catering, and very often it'll point to how well organised we actually are. Because in refuse collection in the main, where we're organised certainly in London boroughs and the municipal councils throughout the country, you'll find that we've generally been able to maintain good agreements with those contractors. But certainly in catering, that's not necessarily the case because the organisation has been weaker and more difficult to sustain. So what I wanted to do really was just take you through the context for local government at the present time. And go back to 1997 and the Single Status Agreement. And although I wasn't an officer responsible at that time, that was pressure at that time in part, not only with regard to equalities, but with regard to employers looking for new freedoms, looking for more freedoms to deal with things at a local level. Hence, each local authority was given the opportunity to develop their own pay and grading structure within their particular authority. We saw Scotland developed their own national council, so they left the previous national structure. There's pressure in Wales now for the same kind of thing because of devolved government that's actually happening, and again you'll find that in the health service. And of course, no doubt there'll start to be pressure in Northern Ireland. All of these things can, if you're not careful, weaken the situation for the national bargaining. In local government, we have three parts really to the national agreement. Part 2, Part 3 and Part 4. Part 2 is really national core conditions, and that is holidays and sickness absence. Part 3 are other issues which can be dealt with locally, so they can be unsocial hours premiums, mileage allowances, those types of things. And what we're already finding in this current climate, Kevin's made reference to this, but employers actually trying to renegotiate not just Part 3 conditions by a variety of means, but actually Part 2 conditions as well, which are national core conditions. And if they don't get a collective agreement, then they look to dismiss and re-engage by issuing a Section 188 notice, 12 weeks notice of impending change of contract. Now, we've seen it in the private sector over the years. Bad employers in the private sector would always follow that particular trend. And it's like negotiating with a gun to your head. Clearly, we never ever thought that we'd see it in the public sector, and yet here it is. And there's no doubt that's going to spread throughout the the rest of the public sector as well. Pensions, again, Kevin's made reference to this, but reformed under the last Labour government, and some would say not necessarily improved, but there were some improvements. There was certainly some cost savings for the taxpayer from those reforms. But now, of course, we see the Hutton review, and there's a stage 2 of that review, of course. We've seen 1, but there's a stage 2 which is likely to touch on whether you maintain final salary schemes in the public sector area, and indeed whether in fact we have things like career average, etc. for public sector pension schemes. And of course an increase in contributions. The Chancellor announced that in effect there'd be a 3% employee increase in contributions, certainly through to 2014/2015. Now, just in terms of other things, pay freezes in local government, we've had one last year in terms of a pay freeze. Even the national government's policy of £250 or more for people under £21,000 a year wasn't taken up by the local government employers. And now, of course, we're actually seeing the cuts driven through at local authority level. And I pay tribute to you colleagues, and indeed the colleagues that aren't here today but are actively involved in demonstrations, involved in starting to work with community groups against the cuts, because it's absolutely vital we have that grassroots uprising, as we've often done. If you take the poll tax, for example, that's again exactly what happened. And there's lots of evidence of that now. I was in Leeds yesterday. There's going to be demonstrations there this week, but not just one demonstration, but a number of demonstrations at the same time around the same city. And that's starting to happen right across the UK, and we'll do everything we can to support that. If I move on now just to what the national agreement does, and again you can read this across to other agreements as well. Pay, conditions, health and safety, workforce development. You know, sometimes we forget about these important things, but if you take some of the groups in local government, excuse me, you'll find that, for example, for school support staff, workforce development is really very, very important. Social care staff, again, workforce development, very, very important. The right to proper training, again, a key element negotiated nationally with a framework agreement, but then should be implementation locally. Pay and grading, so that we had some kind of sensible pay and grading arrangements within local government. Now, those in local government may think that it's been a challenging and difficult time around pay and grading. My God, it has. But without there being guidance nationally and a national joint council scheme, it would have been even more difficult, and indeed the employers would have got away with even more than perhaps they have done so far. And don't forget, one of the emphases I'm really committed to in terms of national agreement is the unity of bringing together large groups of people. It's really important. The more devolved you get and split into different groups, that unity disappears. And certainly when we reformed pensions, one of the key things for local governments was that we kept everyone in the same scheme, because we recognised that if at some stage in the future we wanted to have a dispute, you can only generate that dispute if you get everyone affected by the same issue. That unity of purpose is absolutely vital. And of course, what the local authority national agreement does, and I certainly know that a number of others do as well, is it gives employers freedom. So, for example, it's a minimum rate, if you like, in that particular sector. Doesn't mean to say that employers can't pay more. They can actually pay what they want above that rate that's been set if they want to. It doesn't mean to say there can't be negotiations locally to take place to improve what the national agreement has done. But that national agreement provides a minimum what people actually receive and get. Current state of play, just some interesting facts and figures for you, and a bit of an overview about the employers in the sector as well. And I'd be surprised again, you can liken this to almost every public sector agreement. Opted out councils, 60 or so, mainly in the southeast. I say mainly. Again, mainly district councils, although some noticeable exceptions to that, Kent County Council being one. What we found from various information coming in, there's been some imposition of pay awards in those councils, and indeed arbitration, believe it or not, is used in one or two of those opted out councils as well. The Local Government Association, of course, is now Tory controlled, so there are employers in the sector, if you like. And again, what you'll find is that they're predominantly in favour of local negotiation. Well, why are they? Because they believe that they have more freedom, they have more ability to do workers down in terms of their terms and conditions locally. And of course, we've seen centrally this government already starting to break up national agreements. So I make reference to three particular areas. School support staff negotiating body, again, Kevin will know of this, but it was a body that was brought together to try and get local authorities, school support staff, better terms and conditions. First act of this government was to scrap that body. It may not be particularly relevant to many people here, but they've announced the abolition of the Agricultural Wages Board, which for many isolated rural workers was a minimum wage in that industry. That will now disappear. So you can see quite clearly that both local and indeed national employers in the main are looking to try and weaken and indeed, if possible, get rid of national collective bargaining. Now, I just want to go through some arguments for, and again, you've got these in the packs. These are not exhaustive, by the way. I mean, what I wanted to do was try and engender a bit of discussion. So I've left one or two bits out here. But first of all, you could argue ordered industrial relations, well, it does actually usually get sensible settlements, and there are agreements that are reached. And of course, we have provision nationally and local government anyway for references to arbitration. The question about HR capability, human resource departments, the old personnel departments as we would refer to them as, whether they've got the capability or indeed the capacity to deal with these things at local level, again, is a big issue for us. The cost of doing that at local level, you know, if you have to negotiate locally, both for the union, by the way, in terms of resources, but also for the employer, is very important. And the national agreement, of course, gives you certain flexibility. Unity provides the minimum and enables upward movement. And that's really important. So if an employer says, we haven't got the freedom, we want to pay you more, but we can't, it's a fallacy, it's a lie. Of course they can pay you more if they want to. Union resources is a key issue for us. If you think about local authorities, you think about having to negotiate in each individual local authority, and instead of a national agreement, it has a huge impact on the level of resources needed from the union. And I would just make this point to you. If an employer suggests locally that they want to move to local bargaining, then actually they believe in the long term that they'll benefit from that situation. You've always got to look at where they're coming from, and they'll be coming from weakening the terms and conditions. There are arguments against, by the way. The main one, as far as I'm concerned, is that clearly you have to review the situation if it's not delivering for you. But sometimes you have to be careful you don't do that in the short term. And there are arguments, we would certainly argue in local government. If you look at the past few years, the national agreement has not delivered. But actually, we believe that's been a strategy by the employers to actually encourage a breakdown of that national bargaining machinery. So, Chair, if I move on to practical things to do very quickly, first of all, I'd make a plea on this, seriously. Work together with all the trade unions. You know, it is a multi-union environment in the public sector. We do need to work together, and if we can't work together on these issues, then we are absolutely mad, because it will be to the detriment of our organisations and also to our members. Organise, organise, organise. I can't stress it enough, and I know you perhaps have that drummed into you every day of the week by your own trade unions, but it's absolutely essential. The reality is your employer will listen to you if you've got 95% of the staff organised into the union. They won't if you've got 15 or 20% organised into the union. Be aware of the employer strategy. So, for example, in a multi-union environment, don't let them pick you off, because I can guarantee if they go for what they consider to be the weakest one first, it won't be long before they come for the next, and it won't be long before they come for the next. And what we've seen elsewhere is that, in fact, they can move to de-recognise unions completely and move to consultative arrangements with staff, councils, etc. Be aware of local agreements that might undermine the national agreement, and keep the unions officially informed of the employer moves. Really very, very important. Chair, that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening. My voice has just about lasted out, but clearly, if that's engendered a bit of a debate around this in the context of where we are, then I'll have met my objective for today. Thank you.